And as you're telling your story, really think about it as a story. Try not to write it like an essay. Think about how to make your reader envision where you are, what you're feeling, what you're doing. Add detail like you are telling a story. Some ways of adding vivid detail include trying to show rather than tell. You've probably heard the phrase show, don't tell before, and we'll take a look at an example of that. Try to appeal to the senses, make the reader feel like they are you, they are with you. Make them feel like they're a part of the scene that you're setting. Use descriptive language, interesting word choices. And if you can, try to include dialogue with yourself or with others. So if we look at the idea of showing instead of telling, let's take a look at Alex Tharp's essay, Game Over and Over and Over. Now he could choose to say something like this. Some days after work, I'm stressed, so I play Shadow of Mordor to unwind. That's fine, nothing wrong with it, but it would be better, it would be more effective if he showed us how Shadow of Mordor helps him to unwind. We may not be playing the video game, we may not be there with him, but he can try to give us a better sense of that experience rather than making us just trust that this helps him with his stress. And so what he actually tells us in his narrative is this. Some days after work, there are times I feel like twisting the head off a teddy bear. Instead of bringing Mr. Fluffles to a gruesome demise, I load up Shadow of Mordor, decapitate a legion of orcs, and relax upon the mountain of my slain foes. No, I wouldn't ever be violent in real life, but having something there to safely satisfy that inclination does wonders for my blood pressure. Now, how much more evocative is that image? Maybe you're a little bit more disturbed now that he's mentioned decapitating Mr. Fluffles, but we do get a better sense of how video games are a creative and safe way to deal with stress, amongst other things. Now, not every single part of your narrative has to be full of this level of detail, but as you go over the draft of your narrative, try to find some places where you could show more instead of just telling us that you were scared or that you were proud or that you were frustrated. How can you make us see the experience rather than just telling us about it? Another example from Liza Wicker's Literacy in Hip Hop. She could say, surprisingly, my knack for writing lyrics came easy to me. I wrote a lot of songs, and then move on to the next part of her narrative. But that doesn't tell us much about the songwriting process, and that's part of her literacy. How she wrote songs, what it meant to her. We need to know about that, or else it's not really a narrative. And so what she actually wrote is this. Surprisingly, my knack for writing lyrics came easy to me. After a while, I had filled an entire notebook with raps that I had written and performed in my bathroom mirror. Now that's something we can picture. That gives us a sense of how many songs she wrote. She filled an entire notebook full. We get more of a sense of her determination than we would if she just said, I wrote a lot of songs. And I just noticed I made a typo, but so it goes. And then finally, in Alicia's narrative, the audio narrative that I hope you listen to because I think it's a wonderful narrative, Dyslexia, My Journey Through a Difficult Learning Disability. She tells us, my second grade teacher, Mrs. Spooner, was one of the most supportive teachers I have ever had. But she doesn't stop there. She could tell us that and move on, but then she gives us an example to prove that Mrs. Spooner was supportive. And she mentions that one day Mrs. Spooner brought in an article on William C. Ford Jr. of Ford Motors, and she had Alicia read this article where Ford talked about his everyday struggle with dyslexia and how he never let it discourage him. And she describes the article, and then she tells us how Mrs. Spooner turned to her and said that Alicia was just as capable as anyone else of achieving her dreams. That here's someone else, this story, someone else who had done it, who had overcome the barriers that he felt with his dyslexia, and that Alicia could too. And so that shows how supportive Mrs. Spooner was, that she went to the trouble of finding this story for Alicia to encourage her. So you want to show moments in your story rather than quickly telling us and moving on to the next moment. Your literacy narrative does not need to cover every single thing that has ever happened to you regarding soccer or playing an instrument or whatever your literacy is. Focus on the memories and thoughts that stick out the most and you have the most to say about. You're not writing a book. You're writing a short narrative, and it should be more story than essay. Another way of accomplishing this is to appeal to the senses. Now, once again, this doesn't need to occur in every part of your essay, but perhaps you write a first draft for yourself, and then you go back through and you ask, how can I make this more vivid? How can I make this more exciting for my reader? How can I make them connect to it more? And one way of doing that is telling us what you saw or smelled or heard. You don't have to use all 5 senses, but try to find at least one place in your literacy narrative where you appeal to one of the senses. We see this in Tania Maria Barrientos' essay, Se habla español. She tells us right at the start her journey in learning Spanish when everyone assumed that she must already know it. She says that she was arranging to take a class and she's on the phone. She tells us the man on the other end of the phone line is telling me the classes I've called about are first rate, native speakers in charge. He asks for my name and I supply it, rolling the double R in Barrientos like a pro. That's when I hear the silent snag, the momentary hesitation I've come to expect at this point of the exchange. Now, I apologize that I cannot roll the double R like a pro, but you're meant to hear that in your mind. And you're also meant, oddly enough, to hear the silence, to imagine Barrientos on the phone and that she hears this pause and she knows what it means. She knows that here is someone else who expects her to know Spanish. And this has become a hard thing for her. It's a challenge to her identity and who she is. And so that little detail, it adds something. It makes it a story. She also tells us later in her narrative, as she was learning more Spanish, my vocabulary built quickly, but when I spoke, my tongue felt thick inside my mouth. That's an evocative sensory image. It's something you feel if you sit and think about it. If you've had to learn a new language, or even just with your first language, struggling with public speaking or reading out loud, imagine the tongue feeling thick, the barrier, the hesitance, the difficulty. That's what she's investing, not with a ton of detail that overwhelms us, but key moments where she can add just that little something extra. Think about the kind of language you can use that will make your narrative come to life. This is an excerpt from The Shire is My Family Room by Paul Blazek, which you can read if you choose. It was not one of the original narratives assigned, but it's an example by a student that I have included in the module, and I think it's worth checking out. So he sets up his story, which is about all of the lessons he has learned from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and how he connects this to his family life. He starts in the middle of a scene. We don't yet get to Lord of the Rings. First, we start in Paul's life, in his family, in his day-to-day existence, that the Lord of the Rings, we will discover, helps him to cope with. Imagine, if you will, he says, a typical Tuesday afternoon in my average-looking suburban home. Clamoring noise and squealing resound through the rooms. Small feet run and chase each other with eager vengeance. Pillows fly through the air and sticky brothers poke me and try to sit on my head. This is my normal life. I am 16 years old and I am the eldest of 7 children. Although I love my siblings and my place in the family, my dearest escape and haven is the world of literature. So he could just tell us, I've got a big family and I need to escape sometimes, and so I read Lord of the Rings, right? But that's not a story. The language really adds to the picture. We can imagine a typical Tuesday in Paul Blazek's household where children are running wild and you've got who knows what on your brother's hands, sticky and poking, and it's chaotic, right? And so we can see how he might want to escape now and then into a book with different kinds of adventures than the adventure of being the oldest of 7 children. Another excerpt from his narrative. He has a lot of really descriptive language about his siblings and his home life, just as adventurous as the books he reads, and likely the reading he does contributes to his own language, his own ability to describe a scene. He tells us, my tiny 4-year-old sister throws her arms around my neck, clinging like a koala bear. It is my job to respond with patience and understanding. You learn early on that each individual in the family has an important role to play. Like the interconnected gears of a watch, the family members need to work together in order for the whole unit to function. Here we see Paul using similes. It is like a koala bear when his sister throws her arms around him. Their family is like an interconnected gears of a watch. Those images allow us to connect to the story, to see beyond just normal everyday family things and see the importance and the weight of it. And so adding descriptive language in some aspects of your essay, again, not every sentence needs to be overflowing with um, tons of lengthy words you looked up in a thesaurus, but try to find some places where you know you could add some more description. Have a family member or friend read your draft and ask them, where could I go into more detail? What do you want to know more about? How can I help you to see and feel and hear what I do? That can help your essay really turn into a narrative. We also see some interesting word choices in Matt de la Peña's essay, and they're not nearly as poetic necessarily as the ones we just saw, but they make a difference. After our game the next day, he tells us, which we won on a buzzer beater, I hustled back to my hotel room to continue reading my book. I finished at 4 in the morning. Now, why have I highlighted these things? Well, if you've ever played basketball, you're probably familiar with a coach or a parent yelling, hustle, right, out on the court. But in this instance, he barely focuses on the basketball game because that was not what was important to him right then. Instead, he hustled not on the court, or at least not just on the court, but back to his hotel room. After a game that they won, a buzzer beater, a tense game, you would imagine that maybe his teammates, maybe they want to unwind together, and yet he decides to hustle back to the hotel room and read all night. He might be exhausted from that game, but he is going to stay up till 4 in the morning, right? Even that specific detail to tell us 4 a.m. That adds something to the narrative. So it doesn't mean you have to fill your story with lots of flowery language that is unlike you. But you can still think about deliberate word choices that give your reader a sense of what is happening. Another example is when he's talking about his father, that as he has begun to borrow books from Matt, he's still not entirely okay with this. There's still a sense of a little bit of that shame, or maybe about not being macho enough. And so after dinner, Dad follows Matt outside, and Matt tells us, "He followed me outside the house. I was thinking," he said, looking over his shoulder to make sure we were alone. "Maybe you could let me read whatever books you finish." That little tiny detail. Try to picture it. This dad out in the parking space in front of the house, looking over his shoulder, right? Hoping not to be caught, asking to borrow a book, right? That's kind of ridiculous, right? But we want to have that sense of something that Matt's dad's not yet comfortable with, but he's trying to get there. That helps us see the journey that both of these men are going on. And so those little details, try to add those where you can. They do make a difference. You can also consider adding dialogue. This won't fit with everyone's narrative, and it's okay if you don't remember anybody saying anything particularly significant. It's also okay if you take a little bit of creative license. Liza Wicker's narrative includes a fair amount of dialogue. Do you think that she memorized this completely perfectly, that this is what her mother said to her word for word for word? Probably not. It's okay to try to capture the basics of what somebody said with a little bit of imagination. And so this key moment in her narrative, this dialogue matters. She could have just told us that her mother didn't understand her rap and that she thought that it was bringing shame to the family and to her, but it's much more powerful for Liza to let her mother talk, to give us this dialogue. So we get this here, we get a much more evocative idea of Liza's journey when we see the barriers she had, that her own family wasn't supporting her the way that she needed. And so after this meeting with her teachers, they go to their bus stop, and she says her mom began to scold her. "You were at the school rapping and carrying on, and they are all laughing at you. They're going to think all Black people are just ignorant, and you will never get ahead in this life acting so foolish. Now, I don't want to come back up to this school and hear you've been in there acting a fool in front of them people again. Do you understand?" Right? This is harsh. Imagine you're Liza. Imagine you're so proud of the lyrics you've been writing, the way that you've been performing. And this is what your mother says to you. We can feel with Liza how devastating this must have been, and that she begins to doubt herself, that maybe she shouldn't be doing these things, that maybe her mom is right. But we go through her literacy narrative journey, and we find that, she finds the confidence to keep following her dream, and that eventually her family does begin to understand it a little bit better. But this is a key moment in her story that, adds some conflict that she has to overcome. You can also consider external dialogue and internal dialogue. So we have the comic by Nicole Miles here, and she includes an example of external or outside dialogue, things that other people say, and she also includes her inner dialogue, when we talk to ourselves. So first, she gives us this scene where she imagines, we don't even know who says this exactly, but at some point, many times, people asked her, "Why don't you ever draw Black people?" And she had to think about that. This was a key part in her journey. She'd fallen in love with drawing manga and all these different kinds of characters. And then someone brings up this idea that she calls a big little question. It's one short sentence, but it carries a lot of weight, and she really has to reflect on, why don't I draw Black people? Stuck between, but I do, and they're too hard to draw. I don't think I ever had a real response, she says, until She does, because that's a key part of her literacy journey. And so we see a reflection of her own inner dialogue here. She lets us into her thought process. That is something you can do. She says, the truth is, they were hard for me to draw since I'd never seen any good illustrated reference in the art style that I enjoyed so much. And the process of trying and failing until I got better made me feel inadequate. And here's where she asks herself a question internally. Am I not a good Black person? Right? So this moment, once again, of questioning identity in the midst of the literacy journey, that seems to be a theme among a lot of the readings. It doesn't have to be one that is a part of your narrative, but you might consider it. What does your literacy have to do with who you are and what you value and what you've learned in life? These were some key moments for these writers in which they had to ask some tough questions, encounter some obstacles, and keep pushing. And they tell us that story. And the story comes to life just a little bit more with that added dialogue, with the descriptive word choices, with the vivid detail.